Hello, my name is Alicia Walton, and I am your other instructor for this course. Welcome to Week 3. In preparation for Week 3, we've requested that you read Rhetorical Situations by Mr. Keith Grant Davey. This reading explains how examining a text's rhetorical situation benefits our reading and writing. It contains extended discussion of the concepts of rhetor, audience, and constraints. Initially, you might find this chapter a bit challenging to look at, and specifically this piece within the chapter. Defining rhetoric is not an easy task, and that's really the first thing that you need to do here. So, as you've been looking at the screen, let's talk about what is rhetoric. Defining rhetoric itself is a bit of a difficult task. For example, I spent time in a graduate level course, and the goal in the course was to spend the entire semester defining rhetoric. I clearly do not expect you to do that in our course, but I did want to let you know that if you're having difficulty with the concept of rhetoric, you are not alone. Many people do. Experts in the field of rhetoric have difficulty wrapping their minds around what rhetoric is. In short, these 3 points will help you get a grasp of what rhetoric is. The first point is rhetoric is the study and practice of how we shape knowledge, which is complicated by the multiple ways we can interpret a text. The second point, or as I should say, second definition for rhetoric, is rhetoric can be used to study the purposes of a text. So rhetoric itself, not only is it a study and practice, but it's also a tool that you can use to analyze a text. Why is this piece geared towards me? Am I the audience? Those sorts of questions are using the purpose of it is to use rhetoric to answer those questions. So moving on, the third definition is that rhetoric can be viewed as a performance art whereby writers persuade readers to take action. And one form of this is if you look at first rhetoric as a study and practice, then rhetoric as a tool. This is looking at rhetoric as an actual art form. Rhetoric as an art form is most commonly used in politics, for instance. It's the art of using words to persuade your audience. And in short, truly, rhetoric is the art of using words or any kind of communication to persuade your audience. Using rhetoric or not using rhetoric to your benefit, either way, can change a message. So keep these things in mind, and also be aware that rhetorical situation is its own concept. So there's rhetoric. We've talked about definitions of rhetoric. And again, the most simple definition of rhetoric is using words to communicate or persuade your audience. Communicate with or persuade your audience, excuse me. And you can even go further than that and say that rhetoric is beyond words. So other types of communication can be, such as your physical communication, can also be considered part of a type of rhetoric. But for our purpose, we're just going to focus on the use of words. So let's go on to rhetorical situations and their constituents. So this reading explains how examining a text rhetorical situation benefits our reading and writing, as I said before. So keep in mind that a rhetorical situation exists every time language is used to communicate a message. That means any time you're communicating using language, you have a message, there is a rhetorical situation. Initially, that's a difficult concept to wrap your mind around, and that's okay. I don't ask that you have everything completely in hand as you move forward, but I want you to continue to think about what rhetorical situations are and how it plays a purpose and a role within your messages. The second point I would like you to keep in mind is that readers who understand a text's rhetorical situation will get more out of what they read. So as you're reading, not only do you need to be considering how language and rhetorical situation plays a role within language when you're communicating, you also need to consider what the role is in what you're reading. Point 3. A text's effectiveness or ability to achieve its purpose is directly connected to the writer's understanding of the rhetorical situation to which she is responding. So boiled down, your own understanding of rhetorical situation plays a role in how effective your messages are to your readers. Again, I realize this is a little difficult at first, but it's something to keep in mind as you move forward. Another point I would like you to consider is the definition of rhetorical analysis. So what's rhetorical analysis? Rhetorical analysis is mentioned in this reading, however, there's not too much attention paid to it. Rhetorical analysis is the use of ethos, pathos, and logos within a message to persuade your audience. And although this triangle right here isn't inclusive of all the ways that we can use ethos, pathos, and logos, it truly does capture ethos, pathos, and logos at its core. Logos is considered logic, and it's typically used within the message itself. And when I connect logos to logic, what I mean by that is it's the use of statistics, quotes, etc. to prove your point or persuade your audience. Ethos. Think of ethos as ethics. Ethos is the ethical appeal typically found within the voice of the person sending the message. So an example would be if you are creating a message that's intended to persuade your audience to make sure that they have healthy hearts because it's Heart Health Awareness Month, you would most likely decide to have a doctor speak as part of a presentation that you might be giving about this. Why would you have a doctor speak? And specifically, you might want to have a heart specialist speak. You'd ask this heart specialist to speak because he is your most specific professional expert in the field. If you're putting out a message about heart health and you want me to listen, I'm going to listen a lot more closely if you have a cardiologist speaking to me as part of your presentation than I would if you had a dentist speaking to me. Why? Because dentists specifically work with teeth, cardiologists work with hearts. And I do have to say I would be more likely to listen to even a dentist speak than I might be listening to I don't know, a professional sports player like Dennis Rodman. I'm not going to listen to what Dennis Rodman has to say about my heart health unless somehow he's become a heart specialist. So moving on, let's look at pathos. Pathos, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner here of the triangle, resides mostly in audience themselves. Pathos, think of pathetic or emotional appeal. and think of the term pathetic not so much in its negative connotation, but that it applies to emotions. So an emotional appeal, and by this connection to audience, the specific here is that the emotional appeal lies within the audience themselves. You apply to the emotional appeal within them, I should say. So if we want to have an emotional appeal for our audience, we want to get them excited, happy, or afraid. And these emotions, as we're all well aware, can motivate you to do things. So for instance, it's Heart Health Month again, and you do not have Dennis Rodman speaking to me because I'm not going to listen to him, right? But you have a cardiologist speaking, and he gives me some statistics, which would be logos or logic. And then he tells me a story about how his mother-in-law died from cardiac arrest and how she could have prevented it. And if he, for instance, becomes emotional in his appeal himself while appealing to you emotionally, that's use of pathos. Pathos is when anyone is appealed to via their emotions. And that's just what I would call quick and dirty version of rhetorical analysis so that you can have a basic understanding. Again, don't be afraid to go back and look these things up or ask questions if you need to. We're here to help. Moving on, let's talk about the second reading that you were required to do for this week, and that was the piece Shitty First Drafts by Anne Lamott. This is, I think, one of the most fun pieces in our book. I'd like to start out with this quote from Ernest Hemingway because it's a very powerful one. The first draft of anything is shit. I know a lot of you are probably having some fun with the fact that we're using a word like shit. But frankly, anybody who's ever written a first draft, including myself, we're all aware that the first draft of any kind of paper or article or email that we send, if it's an important email, for instance, if you're communicating with someone so that you can apply for a scholarship or get a job or a co-op position or an internship, that first email that you write out, the first draft isn't usually so good, right? But then you go back and you kind of look at it again and you update it and it starts to take shape. In this piece, Anne Lamott talks about her experiences with writing a first draft. And she likes to give us an honest account of her writing process, which is refreshing, right? I think, and this is one of her points, I think that many students and professionals even, professional writers and editors out there tend to think that everyone above them or everyone who they consider better than them. So for instance, for you, you might think that when I write a first draft, that it's obviously, it's going to be good because I have my master's degree in this field and I'm working on my PhD in this field. Obviously, if I write a first draft, it's going to be great. And you're the only one who has problems with rough drafts. You're the only one who writes shitty first drafts. That is not true. The main point of this piece is that we all write really crappy first drafts. If Ernest Hemingway wrote crappy rough drafts, we all write crappy rough drafts, right? You may not remember or know which pieces Mr. Hemingway has written, but you know his name, chances are. And if you don't, Google him after you watch this, please. Anyway, so she talks about, Lamott does, she talks about her experiences as a writer, and she actually lets us see her process. And she dispels the myth that any writer who's a professional or who does this, who anyone who you've ever seen a final piece from that's wonderful, that obviously they're talented and just a natural gift, and they have a great knack for writing. And then anybody who writes a terrible rough draft doesn't. That's not true. Everyone writes terrible rough drafts. And she talks about also the concept of a child's draft. So that's where the writer actually writes a rough draft and they think about, and they write it as a child, which that's kind of a different way of going about it. But it helps you to kind of see that, you know, however this goes, the most important thing really to take away from this chapter, not only one, first off, we all write crappy rough drafts, first drafts, and secondly, don't let that worry you. Do not let that scare you. That's from what I've seen as a teacher over the years. That's one of the most difficult parts of writing for students, overcoming that fear of writing a terrible first draft. It's okay to write a terrible first draft. If your first draft isn't terrible, honestly, that's when I've worried the most about my own pieces. um, it's part of the process, and so don't worry about it. Usually, in my own writing process, I know my first draft is going to be terrible, so I just kind of draft it out and let it go. And then I'll write a first draft of whether it's an article or a paper, and then I will go kind of walk away, get myself a cup of coffee, and either come back later in the day or even maybe wait a day or two, depending on how my schedule works. And then I come back and start writing again. And that's how that goes. So be prepared to do that. If you're the kind of person who thinks that you don't write a rough draft, you just write it all in one draft, think about your own process and what that looks like really. Most of the time, people who insist that they don't write rough drafts actually do. It's just their editing is, they self-edit is what we call it in the field, and that means you write it out and then you immediately start editing it. Instead of doing that, I think you should go with whatever works best for you, truly. But instead of really focusing on making it perfect the first time, just get out your thoughts, your ideas, even if it's just a basic outline. It doesn't have to even make sense. And then move from there. So the right words rarely fly out or flow out onto the paper, even for published successful writers. The first draft, think of it as a child's draft, which is a starting point. And then finally, remember that it's fine and it's even preferable to write a shitty first draft. This gives you the ability to create an opportunity where the voices in your head are quieted and you can actually begin to start the process of invention.